The group blocked off the entrance to the Mass Pike yesterday near Newbury Street with a 30-foot-long pink sailboat. Activists used the display to urge Governor Charlie Baker to go more in the fight against climate change.
Those horns honking and that news report were from an Extinction Rebellion parade and blockade of a Boston entrance to the Mass Turnpike in 2021.
We'll get an insider's perspective on individual action and activism from an environmental superhero next.
When you've got a planet to save, who you going to call?
Call the GrowthBusters. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
All right, well, welcome to the GrowthBusters podcast. We hold your hand as you come to terms with limits to growth. We've outgrown the planet. We've hit the limits and gone beyond. That rubber band is going to snap back, and we'd best figure out how to shrink the scale of the human enterprise before Mother Nature does it for us. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary GrowthBusters, Hooked on Growth, and founder and senior fellow here at the Center for Busting Pro-Growth Mythology.
And I'm Stephanie Gardner, GrowthBusters advisor, environmental law and policy wonk, and sustainable energy nerd. You'll find us at growthbusters.org. Search for GrowthBusters on Facebook, Twitter, groups.io, and of course your podcast app for the latest growth-busting news.
I'm so glad to have you back, Stephanie. You were missed during our interminably long year-end episode of all of 6 minutes.
Well, and I missed you too. But I'm super excited for our conversation today with my good friend, James Comiskey.
Yeah, I am too. This is pretty neat, and I got to give you credit for coming up with this brilliant idea. So what are we going to do today?
We're going to talk to someone that's out there doing great work and learn more about climate activism. Yeah, so let's jump into it with James. Well, welcome, James, to the podcast. I'm thrilled to have you on. We go way back. I think we probably met in 2015. We're coworkers, and I've just really felt inspired by you as my friend over the years. We've had some good water cooler conversations about sustainability, all kinds of wide-ranging topics. And even though we don't work at the same company anymore, I follow you on your social media and really love a lot of the content that you share with your family and friends. And so really excited to have you on our podcast and learn more about how you came to be a climate activist in your personal life. So welcome, James.
Thank you, Dave and Steph. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm even more excited than Stephanie is because it's just not every day that I get to talk to a fellow superhero. Once I saw your Instagram posts, I just was in awe, and I'm really thrilled to find out what makes you tick.
Yeah.
Lovely. I have to tell a quick story to return the favor to Steph, because I remember before Steph and I became friends, there was this seminar that they hosted at work about renewable energy credits. I think it was a specific company that was trying to sell theirs. And I remember Steph asking so many great questions during the session, and then afterwards, I think you were making sure everyone on our floor knew to do the proper research and know where their recs came from. And I was like, I want to be friends with that girl.
Lots of mutual respect and interest between us, for sure.
Didn't we do an episode called The Obsessive Compulsive's Guide to Travel or something like that? So here we are. We've got a support group going for obsessive compulsives about living more sustainably.
Yeah. So James, why don't you give us a little bit of a background from your point of view of how you got to where you are now and how you're trying to live along the lines of your environmental beliefs and with a lot of morality attached to that.
Yeah, I knew I wanted to be in the environmental space since high school. I don't remember where specifically I learned about the concept of global warming. I hope it was at school. I think it was at school. And as soon as I was told about that phenomenon, I knew that I wanted to do something to combat it. I mean, it terrified me and it confused me why it wasn't being talked about more. And I was, in high school, my favorite classes were math and science focused. And so I decided to go to college for environmental engineering, not knowing exactly what I wanted to do with that degree, but knowing that it was going to be something that would give me some flexibility and hopefully land me a job where I could work in the combating climate change space. And once I graduated, I was sort of looking for jobs. I grew up in Connecticut, so I was looking anywhere from the Boston to New York area, and through a mutual friend found the job at that Steph and I worked together at in 2012 when I graduated. And the energy, I wasn't specifically looking for the energy space, but it was probably one of my top choices, just given its huge piece in this environmental puzzle to figure out. And I think, I was very happy working in the energy management space for years. And I think as, a lot has changed in climate in just the past 10 years in terms of where we are and where we've been. And I think I was sort of becoming a little bit more jaded about the lack of progress, and wasn't just working in the industry wasn't quite satisfying the itch. And so I started to look up some environmental organizations and joined a couple and went to a few meetings, and really liked talking with like-minded people and thinking about different questions with them. But I always left meetings sort of wondering how much we were actually accomplishing, and it sort of felt a little bit more like networking to me than climate action. And at that time, I was also starting to take, more of an activist role, let's say, in individual choices, and thinking a lot about where my own emissions come from and footprint comes from. And so I was starting to make a lot of changes in my day-to-day life. And at that time, I feel like there were a lot of climate documentaries that were coming out. One documentary that really hit me hard was Before the Flood. And I remember finishing that documentary and being like, I'm not doing enough, and no one's doing enough, and what are we doing? And so I was in this really anxious space about climate. And I was at a cafe in Jamaica Plain here in Massachusetts, in Boston, and there was this flyer on the window of the cafe that said, Extinction Rebellion declares itself in rebellion against the government for its criminal inaction on climate. And I was like, wow, that sentence captures how I feel. I'm angry, and I think I have a right to be angry, and there's not enough being done, and we're not taking this seriously enough. And so...
And how long ago was that? When did you see this flyer posted?
That was in early 2019. And I had Extinction Rebellion started in the UK the year prior, and I had no idea. I didn't know about it. I just saw this flyer and was like, that seems like a group of people that, is talking about this as the emergency I think it is. And that sort of sparked my entrance into activism, and I was sort of embarrassed and humbled to hear about the decades of activism work and nonviolent direct action that I just had no idea was happening. And there were these wonderful, passionate people who had so much knowledge and wisdom about social change and how to use protests as a way to move the Overton window and to pressure the government. And so for the past 3 years, activism has been my primary sort of climate focus, in addition to now all the individual choices and career that I'm in. And so I sort of think about that as the trifecta of where I work, what I do in my day-to-day life, and activism. So that's my climate journey in a short story.
And what's your current job?
I work as an analyst on a sustainability team. Our company is a renewable energy company here in North America, and also does energy management practices. The company I work for is an international utility, so it is a traditional utility, but they acquired the company Steph and I worked for back in 2017, was it?
Mm-hmm.
So your job has elements of your passion in it.
For sure.
But I'm guessing because you're working for the man, it may not be quite as radical as you'd like it to be, huh?
Yes, exactly. And it's a very important piece of this puzzle, and we will, the transition to renewable energy is at 100% a necessary solution. It's just not everything, and has a very corporate context attached to it, and I think we need to be going beyond that.
Well, what do you think about the concept of corporate responsibility? And because you're in corporate sustainability, so you're trying to make your company more sustainable, but then there's sort of this larger idea of corporations in general and climate in general. So how do you view those different pieces, and how do you show up to work and try to make a difference in that larger system?
It's a really great question. I see corporations as part of the solution, if not a really big piece of the solution. But I think that the corporation's goal, at least in the U.S. context, is still based upon growth. And so working for a renewable energy company, I think what we're not discussing is we can't continue to have our energy needs grow the way that they are today and just switch to renewables and think that we're going to be all right. Mm-hmm. There needs to be a scale back in the use of energy. It needs to be a shift to renewables, and we need to be using less energy. I don't think we're talking about the latter at all in the corporate context, which makes sense, right? I mean, to exist as a corporation today, you sort of have to adopt that model. And that's a whole other piece that I think the activism helps with, which is, what you talk about on this podcast, which is we have this model of infinite growth on a finite planet. And so that is not the solution that is going to get us where we need to be.
I would kind of guess that most of the top decision makers in a company like that probably don't even realize what you realize, which is that we can't just switch this hog of a global economy over to renewable energy and keep on going. Do they realize that we really need serious energy descent along with the switch over to renewables?
It's not something you hear talked about at all. I don't think I've ever heard someone at work talk about degrowth or climate solutions that would end up, being in contrast to our economic models. That's not to say I don't think other people, I don't think I'm the sole person for the company that thinks that, right? I'm sure there are other people like me who are sort of in that cognitive dissonance of, I know I work for this company and I know that this solution is a necessary one, but this exact model isn't going to be it. And maybe that's even at the executive level, but I think we are all people living in today's world and need paychecks, right? So,
well, and it could be, if a company is really providing the cleanest energy that we know how to provide, then that would be a part of the economy that we would embrace the growth of, and we would want other parts of the economy to be shrinking. So the right companies could really be pretty well focused on growth, and it wouldn't necessarily be a result of criminal intent. But do you kind of see it as your role to sort of bring everybody along and educate them about things like the fact that we need energy descent too? Or is it even important for them to understand that?
I do think of that as my role a little bit, and I think in the past couple years I've stopped shying away, and this is definitely activism's influence of having those conversations, or sort of reminding people of the yes and. It's a difficult balance because you are trying not to discourage people or tell them what they're doing doesn't matter. It absolutely does. And so it's it's something that I'm still sort of figuring out how to tiptoe between the corporate environment and the activism environment. I certainly like to do it, not in a, I like scaring people or trying to be the, sort of Debbie Downer in the room, but I like to add my flair to it. And I hope and think that people resonate with it as long as it's done in a empathetic way, I suppose.
Yeah. And one thing that probably does have an impact, even though it's more like a cultural kind of a invisible thing that's happening, is you've taken a no flight pledge just as a human being living on the planet. But the company wants to send you to different places, and normally they would fly you, but you have taken the train. In fact, recently I think you took a really long train ride from Boston to Texas, and you asked the company to pay for that ticket. So what has been the reaction to those types of moral, standing behind your morals and what you believe in the context of this corporate job?
Yeah, that's a great question. And
I know the answer to that. He's on the CEO track. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, and I've been working at this company for 10 years now, and I just switched a year and a half ago to this sustainability team. And when I moved and took the offer, there was, I forget the percent, but there was some percent of travel assumed in the offer letter. And I, before accepting it, asked for half of that percent of travel and only to places that I could access by train. And so I sort of let them know up front, this is what I'm willing to do. And I told them the why, and thankfully I work for a sustainability team that couldn't say no, so not to say I'm, trying to trap them or anything like that, but, I'm trying to help them put the walk to the talk of, if we're going to call ourselves a climate solution and a sustainability team within the climate solution, we need to be talking about steps like this and ask ourselves what is worth it in terms of how can we make sure that we're doing our jobs efficiently, and what does that mean in terms of how much time we need to spend in person, and then how do we execute on that. And same thing for the travel I took recently to Texas. This would be our annual get together with, we're mostly a remote team. And so I do see a lot of value in getting everyone in the same room. I think if we don't do that, I'm not going to be able to place my work with these people, and I'll become disengaged. And then what good is that if I become disengaged? So I'm on board with meeting, every once in a while in person. And I sort of laid out in an email, I calculated the emission savings that it would result in and what the price increase would be, and basically said, I'm absolutely willing to do this, but I think these are my requirements in order to get there. And I had already planted that seed, so I think they knew it was coming. What has helped is that we actually have some executive buy-in with that. One of our heads at the company just this year had a conversation with me because I talk about this in meetings. He contacted me and said, I don't want to fly for any of my travel at work anymore. We sort of figured out what that would mean for him. And so it helps that I also have an executive to point to and say, well, he's doing it, so why can't I do it? So, finding levers to pull like that, I think, has been really helpful. And certainly we met with people who live in Texas, and the emotional piece of telling people you took 58 hours to get there on the train, like, some people's minds were blown, and they were like, oh my God, I can't believe someone takes this that seriously. And I don't think they're necessarily going to do it tomorrow, but it impacted them, and now they're thinking about it. So it's not just for my own footprint, it's for the conversation of it.
In fact, you recorded a video of yourself on the train ride and you posted it to your social media. So I, as your friend, even though I'm not your colleague anymore, saw it and was really inspired by it, and would love to play a clip of that on the podcast here if we can.
I am on the longest train trip I've ever taken, 58 hours from Boston to Texas. And I am doing this as a way of cutting my transportation emissions as compared to flying. I used EPA and DEFRA emissions factors to calculate that. By my taking the train as compared to flying, I'm reducing my emissions by about 25 to 30%. That might not sound like as much as you'd expect, and that's for two main reasons. One, the Amtrak only uses diesel outside of the Northeast Corridor. The Northeast Corridor being Boston down to DC. That's totally electrified. The rest of the rail that Amtrak travels on, they have to use diesel. And that's because they don't own the rail and they can't electrify it on their own. They're using freight lines. The second reason is that it's not a very straight line. I went from Boston over to Chicago, then transferred, and then you go down to Texas. So it makes kind of this right angle, whereas if you were to take more of a direct route, kind of imagine it like the hypotenuse, you're traveling less miles. So less miles means less emissions. Let's say in the Northeast Corridor, if I was to take the train from Boston to New York instead of flying, that's electrified and it's a pretty straight distance. So I'd be seeing an 85% emissions reduction by taking the train. If we went Boston to Chicago, a straight line for the most part, but using diesel, it's about a 40% emissions reductions. So let's take even the worst case, which is this one, that it's only a 25 to 30% emissions reduction. Doesn't sound like much, but it actually is a tremendous impact. Imagine if everyone took efforts today to reduce their transportation emissions by 25 to 30%. That's massive. The United States has only managed to cut our emissions by about 15% in the past 14 years. So to see an immediate result of 25 to 30% reduction by an action you can take is really big comparatively. And that's for now. Hopefully the Amtrak continues to electrify and technology continues to improve so that these trips are even less emissions intensive. I'm also doing this to sort of have people question themselves and think about what they'd be willing to do in order to meet our drastic emissions cuts requirements. If you're thinking like, this is nuts, or I could never do that, it takes way too long. As far as climate action goes, this is pretty nice. I get to enjoy the scenery, I get to read a book, I eat in the dining car. During my layover in Chicago, I go out and take a run and grab something to eat, and I can use my hotspot when I need to get some work done.
It's nice to remind ourselves that we need to take time sometimes and slow down and not expect something so immediately. We can take time to reflect and care for ourselves. It makes you appreciate the destination much more when you get to see firsthand what it takes to get there. One last thing, I do not want anyone to influence you by letting you think that your individual actions do not matter. That's how we stay stuck in the situations we've been in. How can 8 billion people's individual actions not matter? They do matter. You vote with your money and your actions, you create conversations and you inspire others around you, and you walk the talk and you live your morals. It feels good. It's quite beautiful when you do. See you on the train.
Bravo. It's great that you're an analyst, because it probably took you all of 12 seconds to figure out the emissions reductions of those trips, which is great, but also a great orator too, or writer. I mean, really just so well articulated. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Real quick, circling back to before we played that, some of your cohorts were surprised that you would take it so seriously. Should we talk about that for a second? I mean, it's kind of a life or death situation, you know, it's extinction or not. What could possibly be more serious than that?
Right. In my mind, it's very simple. We all know we're too late on our timeline, and we're on a very short timeline for what we've now delayed. And it's just a choice. Either we take the action and take the sacrifice to avoid this destruction ahead of us, or we don't. And it really, to me, doesn't need to be more complicated than that. But there's so many factors at play, I think, that prevent people from seeing it that way. One, they may not know the truth, right? If they're not listening to podcasts like this one or following climate scientists on their social media, they're only getting it through mainstream media, which is not doing its job in telling the whole truth about where we are and what the repercussions will be. It's getting better, but the sense of urgency is not there yet. I mean, we're still bought into the idea that we can fix this through techno-optimism. And I think people have not come to terms yet with the fact that just the way we live our lives today is unsustainable. And yes, technology will help us get there, but if we're truly going to tackle this crisis, I don't think our lives can look like they look like today, at least for those in, let's say, the 10% globally, But a huge piece that I think is missing for them is that doesn't mean it is a worse life. It might mean a better one, a slower one in good ways, less stress, more time for you and your family. There are concepts of degrowth that I think people get scared of, but really it can be such a beautiful societal model, and I'm certainly not well versed in it. There are people who talk about this and study this, but I think it scares people to say, oh gosh, I can't take 2 days to go on the train. But how do we get that person to a spot where that sounds nice, something that they want to do for themselves, care that they want to take for their planet and for their own person? So yeah, there's a ton to unpack there.
Well, you did a great job of selling that. So you're posting these kinds of clips on your Instagram account. What do you know about the people that are following you? Is it mostly friends, and what kind of feedback are you getting?
I think it's mostly friends. I'm certainly not trying to become some kind of climate influencer. I am trying to speak to my own friends and family directly. And I think social media is a great way to do that. And I could also talk about this for an hour. It is mostly very encouraging to hear from people. And I do hear from people about at least how it makes them think. I'm not necessarily seeing action from those who are very close to me. And I sort of waffle in my motivations to talk about climate online because as I'm sure all three of us understand, there's this sort of there can be shame or embarrassment in making it about climate. Like, oh God, here he goes again, talking about climate. And I fear that when I put, as I hit send, that someone's going to interpret it that way and roll their eyes at me. And then there are days where maybe I do post something about my frustration, not with people, but, a day where I'm not feeling so great about climate, and I say something about it, and someone will respond and say, I just want you to know how much, you're posting impacts me and makes me, make changes in my life. And I think about you when I'm at the grocery store, and I'm like, okay, you know what? Maybe I am making a difference. And so, I think as a long trend, it's really motivating, but it certainly has its ups and downs.
Fair enough. I definitely find you so inspiring, and I look to you as just sort of like you're a normal person to me. You are a superhero at the end of the day, but like you are just my colleague that I met when I was in my mid-20s, and we, did pub trivia and fun nights out and stuff. And usually on the podcast we have academics, professors, authors, people that are studying something very specific and have a niche and have an expertise. And I just don't view them necessarily as like normal people. But you are a normal person that is doing this, and that's so inspiring to others. And I love that you're sharing that on your social media where people like me can see it. And, we're in a dinner club together with some of our friends. And, every dinner club, there's interesting conversations. And in fact, I wanted to mention the last one we did just a couple weeks ago, where we cook. We all cook together and do a big meal together. But we had decided to do a cookie swap for the holidays. And so we were cooking the cookies, but we were going to get takeout for the first time ever in our club. And you insisted on this Thai restaurant that you knew would let you bring your own reusable containers to. And we were all excited to try this because I don't think any of us had done takeout with reusable containers. And you show up there at the Thai restaurant and say, I'm going to order 8 dishes. And they just like gave you this crazy look. But they did it. And you biked to the restaurant and brought it back for all of us. And it was great. It was so inspiring. And now I totally feel inspired to try this on my own too.
And by doing that, not only did you reduce the impact of that meal, but you impacted everyone at that restaurant. You kind of moved the norm a little bit. They're going to be more ready for that. Some of them are going to think about doing that themselves when they order takeout, when they go to Carl's Jr. to get some all-beef burgers.
I hope so. I hope so. That's the intent. And I think that ties in with what we were just talking about as well, is that I think people want – this is something I see in social media. People want solutions. People want you to tell them what to do. If you educate them enough on the crisis, and, people, I think – for the most part, will be like, oh my gosh, I need to do something. What can I do? And so I like to share these things as ideas. I think a lot of times when people ask that question, they sort of want you to tell them the one thing that they can do and then not do again. Like, oh, you just donate to this place and then you're done.
Recycle.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's well-intentioned, but sometimes I get the answer and they're like, oh, and they kind of put it off. But I think people like to hear about these things, and I hope that's what displaying that does. It's much easier in the city to do the takeout with your own containers. I know that sort of can defeat the purpose of the draw of takeout, right? You can order it from your couch and it will come to you in a package. But, for those of us that live in more populated areas, that could mean just going a block or two down your street. It's a short walk, you bring it, and then you come back. Most of I always call first if people are going to try this, call the establishment first, because if you show up and then they don't allow it, you sort of wasted your own time. Most will do it because they want the business and because you're actually making it cheaper for them because they're not using their own, they have to buy all that Tupperware. So it's kind of a win-win for them, and so they'll do it. I've only been denied by a couple places, and then, you just go on to the next one. So maybe it limits where you get takeout from, but I think it's a really useful trick.
In fact, one of my favorite clips of yours is your clip that you did on Instagram about this zero waste takeout. So let's listen to that, shall we?
About 1/3 of Americans get some form of takeout food every day. That's 100 million people ordering food via disposable bags, containers, and cutlery, much of it made from plastic that's going to end up back in our environment as microplastics. The easiest way to cut back on this is to make more food at home, but if you're going to order takeout, you can often use your own container. Many places will accept your own Tupperware if you bring it. It helps if you call ahead first to let them know that you're coming. If you live in a city, it's even easier to walk or bike there and avoid the transportation emissions. Try it with me.
Steve, JP, may I help you?
Hi, yes. If I bring my own container, can I get takeout from my own container?
What you would like to order? How many dishes?
Just one, just a noodle dish if I come in and bring it.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, awesome. I'll be there in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Make sure your container is and looks clean. They're not going to accept it if it's got streaks and marks on it.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, Steve.
Appreciate it.
No problem.
Have a good one.
You too.
Ta-da! Zero waste takeout. When ordering takeout, either on the phone or online, you can often specify specific instructions not to include single-use cutlery or small sauce containers, etc. Our collective actions at scale matter tremendously, but remember that systemic change is more effective than individual change. So keep pressuring businesses and government to offer the most sustainable choices to us consumers. Happy eating.
Yeah, I loved that one. That was great. Some good video editing in there too. Telling the little story.
Yeah, that took some practice.
I think you even had a little section where you're like riding your bike. Loved that. So yeah, such a great idea, really inspiring. And then the other thing that happened at our dinner club was you went to get the Thai food and you came back and then we're setting it all up and we're all passing things around. And one of our friends said, oh, do any of these dishes have meat in it? And you're like, no. And we all know that you're vegan. And so we do, when we are planning our meals in our dinner club, we make sure that there's enough food that you can eat and everything. But oftentimes we still cook meat. But it was great that you were able to sort of make that sustainable choice for the group. And I personally didn't miss the meat at all. I thought everything we had was delicious, lots of vegetables, lots of rice, noodles, everything. And so, yeah, it's just all those little things add up and ultimately influence others. So I thought that was great.
Thanks. Yeah. It was our friend, Steph, and my friend Tim that asked, who was definitely the most carnivorous of all of us.
Very carnivorous.
And said, what's the ratio of meat to non-meat here? And I was like, 0. So you all said you trust me, so.
Well, you had probably done the analysis so you could fill him in on the protein content.
No, I should have.
Put his mind at ease a little bit.
All right. So we've obviously been talking about some of the different individual actions you've taken in your life, a lot of which have been inspired by your climate activism. I'd really love to learn more about the climate activism that you've done with Extinction Rebellion since you joined the group in 2019 and what that journey for you has been like.
I guess just to emotionally transition it, I think this is a good example of a yes and. I think there's many ways in which, corporations and fossil fuel companies invented recycling and the term carbon footprint, right, to try and put the onus on consumers and take it off of themselves and the corporate responsibility for this disposal and this management of all of the contributing factors to climate change. And so, I think in some ways it can be a bit regressive to think about it in terms of our individual impact. But, to me, it's a yes and. A lot of the solutions that I think we would head towards are things that we would need to change in our daily lives anyway, either whether it's a political solution or a digital solution. I think they're sort of means to the same end a bit. Maybe not exactly, but I think it'll make it easier for us if we try to take these actions personally that are going to be end results of what we're pushing for through activism.
Well, I like the way that you explain, in a number of your posts about, I think you do a good job of explaining that individual action has real value, but don't forget that we need to keep pushing for systemic action. And I think you obviously recognize this. One is the power of, 7 billion people doing some individual action. In a way, that's changing the system. And I don't know if you would agree with this, but it seems to me like a lot of the systemic action we're pushing for is just so that it would force us all or make it easier for us all to take the more ethical individual actions anyway.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, my journey with activism, I sort of told the story of how I found the group that I primarily organize with now. And I remember my first couple meetings with Extinction Rebellion, I was sort of in awe of the people around me. They just seemed so cool and so knowledgeable, and they were having conversations that I was not accessing, with my colleagues or friends. And I there were even people that I would look at and be like, oh my God, I want to be friends with that person. And I am. Now I am. And I was intimidated by them because, at least for, I think Extinction Rebellion is on the edgier side of activism. They use a lot of nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience, a lot of tactics where people are risking arrest for what they're doing. It's not always, it can be traditional rallies or protests where people have picket signs outside of the State House, let's say, which are totally valuable. But just the tactics that we were talking about, I was intimidated by. And now, a short period of time later, I am now the one helping to plan those actions. It's a really nice reflection to think back on.
Well, why don't you tell us about some of the actions you've done and what those were like, and maybe what role you played in them, just to give us a sense of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, sure. I think the first action I ever took with Extinction Rebellion, we were disrupting a gas convention here in Boston. They were at the Westin Hotel. And, it's this annual conference where they shake each other's hands and talk about how they're going to increase gas production. And so our group decided to go and to disrupt that and to say, quote, natural gas is not a transition fuel. You don't need that crutch. We can go from one directly to renewables. And so I was just a bystander. I wasn't in any of the working groups or the planning pieces of this. I was just sort of watching it all go down with my jaw dropped. And, we talked about how we're going to do that. And so we had people kind of scope out the layout of the hotel and look at the conference schedule. And then we brought it back and talked about how we could disrupt it or which session we want to disrupt and how. And talked about bringing a banner in and sort of sitting in the conference and maybe ask leading questions and then sort of declare who we are and what we're demanding. And, you go through all these fun iterations of it. And I, being a little bit intimidated, my role that day, the day of the action, was to be someone's arrest support. So I was sort of assigned someone who was risking arrest that day to know if they were arrested and they were being held, who do I notify from their family or loved ones, or do they have plants or a pet to take care of, or are there medications they had that I need to make sure the police know about? I was very ready for that, and that felt like a really cool way to plug in and participate and to support someone who is doing something that I don't think I could do myself. And that went really well. We brought there are many brass bands around the Boston area that help out activist groups pro bono, and so we brought a big brass band into the hotel and we disrupted it with some fanfare, and we ended up getting thwarted and stopped to actually disrupt the sort of like keynote speaker event. And so what we ended up doing is sort of blocking the entrance to the hotel. You can come up with sort of escalation tactics or plan Bs in leading up to a protest or a rally. And I don't think we had come up with this one, but we sort of conferenced on the side about, okay, now what? Because we're not going to get into the main thing. And okay, what if we just block the entrance to any newcomers, or if someone leaves, we don't let them back in. And so that's what we ended up doing. And people spoke ad lib outside of the hotel while people flyered to passersby saying what we're doing. And my person that I was supporting did get arrested, and I got to call their significant other. And that ended up being a pretty easy process. They were out very quickly from jail, and the charges, I think, were dropped before they were arraigned. So at that point, I was in. This was cool. Like, I was having a great time doing this.
It sounds exciting.
Yeah, it was really exciting. And it was a very emotional day. And since, to sort of fast forward, I started to dip my toe into different, there's different working groups, at least in Extinction Rebellion, where there's the action group who helps to plan the logistics and, what we're doing and where. There's the outreach group who's in charge of sort of flyering at some of our events or putting on talks. We have talks that we do every once in a while at different community outreach, essentially. There's an art working group. So part of Extinction Rebellion is we want to kind of go beyond just cardboard signs and have these really vibrant flags and pieces of art for different protests. So anyway, there's lots of ways to get plugged into activism that's not risking arrest or, needing to put yourself on the line like that. You can be behind the scenes. We even have an infrastructure group that sort of works on our communications, how we talk to each other. So I started to get involved with outreach, and I really liked that. But then the more I was a part of the organization, I wanted to be in the action. So I started with the action working group, and I risked arrest for the first time. I think it was in late 2019. Yes, it was in late 2019 in Boston at an action where we blocked a bridge in the seaport. And our message was, we're going to disrupt until the state declares a climate emergency. Because under an emergency declaration, it allows access to funds and resources that wouldn't otherwise be accessible if you weren't in an emergency state declaration. So it's kind of like a first step in sort of taking action. Extinction Rebellion has a set of demands, and that's part of one of our first ones. And it was sort of just getting exposure to different actions and feeling more comfortable with the process. But I have to say, it was mostly, there's so much that goes on in nonviolent civil disobedience, and these really intelligent people who have done this kind of work for decades. I mean, we're lucky enough to have people that organize with us who were part of anti-war demonstrations in the 60s and 70s, and they bring with them so much wisdom and knowledge about how to put on effective demonstrations, and I felt really cared for. I felt, yes, I'm going into this risking arrest, and there's a lot of unknowns there, but I felt really confident in what I was doing, both from a feeling this is important enough to do this for, and also that I felt comfortable with the process. We work with the National Lawyers Guild, which is a group of attorneys that provides pro bono coverage for social activists whose causes they believe in. They're a very progressive group. The fact that they exist, I think, is incredible, because they take so much time out of their days to meet with us before an action and say, okay, if you're going to do this kind of thing, they don't advise us. They're just saying, you told us you want to do this. Okay, you should expect these kinds of charges, and here's how the process will go. And, they can't guarantee anything, but likely this charge will get dismissed, and this one might carry forward, and blah, blah, blah. So you've got the legal coverage. You have sort of your plan. We have street medics for some of the actions that we have in the streets. It's this very, very orchestrated action, and I think people don't know that. I think people read headlines in the news and say, "Oh my God, what a group of radical people doing this thing." And I guess it can be, and it is, but there's so much going on behind the scenes that makes the people feel really well taken care of. So I've now risked arrest, I think, close to 10 times with Extinction Rebellion. I've been arrested 3 times, and due to multiple factors, I think climate change being a cause that most people agree with as an urgent issue to varying degrees.
Especially in Massachusetts.
Exactly. Being in Boston, as far as police and the legal system goes, Boston is a more progressive place to be. And for sure, being a white male, I have not had any of my arrests stay on I have an arrest record, but they've all been dismissed. Sometimes that was a lengthy process, and our attorneys had to do a lot of work to sort of negotiate that and go through that process. And now my main role within Extinction Rebellion is helping to plan the actions and all of those logistics. So sometimes we're doing it as general disruption, which is disruption for disruption's sake, and to say, hey, we apologize. We know that we're blocking people's day or disrupting you, but that is the point, because if we do traditional protests and traditional rallies, it doesn't get covered, and it doesn't bring the urgency into the conversation that needs to be brought in. And we've heard that directly. We have an interesting relationship with the media in that we need them, to cover what we do, but also we're sort of pointing fingers at them as not doing enough. So sometimes we sort of work with them and against at the same time. But we've been told by different media outlets that unless you do escalated tactics, you're not going to get covered. At least in Boston, there's enough protest and social work that goes on that they can't cover everything. And so disruption like that, and general disruption of the public tends to be the kind of protest that gets media attention. And so that's one of our tactics. And the other tactic is targeted disruption, which is we're going to go right directly to the doorsteps of the people who are, the corporations and fossil fuel companies and lawyers that provide assistance to the fossil fuel companies in court cases. We're going to go to their doorsteps, and we're going to bring our disobedience to them and demand that they change. So we sort of take both tactics, because one speaks to the public and one speaks to the bad players.
Now, you mentioned that your concern about our disruption of the climate is what led you to Extinction Rebellion, but that's not the only issue on the table at Extinction Rebellion, right?
Right, yeah. What Extinction Rebellion talks a lot about is the climate and ecological emergency, which is to say the planetary destruction that we're seeing and are anticipating is not just carbon emissions, although that is obviously such a huge piece of it, but the ecological emergency the sixth mass extinction that we're entering in right now, the primary causes of biodiversity loss are mostly habitat loss, development, hunting, fishing, pesticide use, in addition to climate change and warming waters and different temperatures and migrations related to that. But there's this whole other piece that doesn't get its fair share of attention in the climate crisis, which is ecological devastation. And so Extinction Rebellion tries to focus our demands on that as well, because if we ignore that piece of it, we're only going to solve a piece of this.
Yeah. So I'm glad for that, because certainly we want to alert people and inspire them to get behind the right kind of behaviors and policies in regard to the climate. But that's just one of the many symptoms of the insane things we're doing.
Right. I think an important thing, especially for listeners who may not understand activism's role, right, is that there's a lot of important pieces about activism. And if you think about massive social change, at least in this country, civil rights, gay rights, suffragette movement, it all came from people in the streets taking action. Those were all nonviolent civil disobedience campaigns. I'm sort of embarrassed when I started with activism. When we go through nonviolent direct action trainings, there was an instructor that sort of talked about the history of nonviolent civil disobedience and the shoulders that we stand on. And when I learned about Rosa Parks in school, I don't know if I wasn't taught this or if I sort of, just didn't digest it. It wasn't just a brave woman who said no on the bus, right? That was a planned, those were part of the bus protests, right? They met. That was a whole nonviolent civil disobedience campaign. And, Martin Luther King Jr., this was all a very orchestrated event that took place. And I was sort of embarrassed to know that there was this world I wasn't a part of or aware of, and researchers who show that. There's this researcher who we reference often in our talks, Erica Chenoweth, who studied social movements and campaigns internationally over a period of time, and who showed that nonviolent resistance is not only the moral high ground in terms of social change, but is also the more effective one, and that social movements who use nonviolent practices over violent ones and who sustained, I believe it's 3.5% of a population. Any campaign that achieved 3.5% of its population succeeded, which is both a very small number and a very large number. It sounds small, but when you if you take the number of people in a protest and then figure out what percent of the community that is, it's a very small percent of that community. And so it is proven in this country and other international movements to work. And so it's not just a group of passionate people who are sort of causing trouble to cause trouble, right? These people want to affect change, and that is a proven way of doing it because you're increasing the urgency behind the issue for both the public and the government. And so that means more people are going to act and more people are going to vote with that in mind. And politicians are going to understand, oh, wow, people really want to see, this kind of action. And so it can be slow moving. And I think a lot of people who take a role in activism burn out quickly because they expect their actions to see immediate results. And it doesn't. Like any campaign, it's going to take years. But that is sort of the theory of change, is that we're getting more media attention, we're getting more people involved, and we're sort of pushing the needle even further than where it needs to go, so that inevitably, when we fall back because governments don't act with the urgency that we ask them to, we're going to be pushing us further and further in the right direction. And so we sort of iterate on that process over and over again until we see results. And I think one of the biggest, it's hard to point at a specific event in activism and say, we achieved this thing. A lot of it is sort of immeasurable in some way. But I talked about the media piece, and we had gone to the Boston Globe as the sort of largest media outlet in the Boston area multiple times to say, the climate crisis threatens more lives globally than any war combined, right? And so you need to be reporting on this with a World War level scale of coverage, because why wouldn't you? You do it for wars, do it for climate. And then we even had a little mock-up of what we think the news should look like, and we brought that to them, and again brought the band and made a whole fanfare. And there are, environmental reporters at the Globe who were upset with us because they do that work at the Boston Globe, and they're trying to get the Globe to cover climate more. But about a year ago, the Boston Globe released a climate desk, a specific climate reporting team, and they hired 2 to 3 new climate reporters. And they announced this whole new campaign called Into the Red, where they're going to really increase their climate coverage. And we met with them, again, we had this interesting relationship, to talk to them about what this new desk is going to do and the kind of coverage we would like to see, and they were very open to it. And the new reporters thanked our group because they said, without your work and calling that out, I don't think we would have been hired. And that was like a real tangible win for us because it was sort of proof that it does work. I hope that's happening at the political scale as well, but you don't always get that kind of direct gratification. So that was really as proof that our work is working, hopefully.
You might have been able to get the same result by inviting the publisher of the Boston Globe to wine and dinner at some fancy restaurant and having a collegial conversation about that instead of being in their face, right?
Yeah, over a steak dinner.
Yeah. I have a question about Extinction Rebellion. You've talked about the training and the planning, and it sounds really very professional, and yet isn't Extinction Rebellion just extremely decentralized? I'm surprised that they do this so professionally when there's not a headquarters full of paid staff somewhere.
Yeah, that's a good question. There are some chapters actually we have one paid part-time employee. And I think some different chapters internationally have gotten big enough and have enough funding that they can do that. But yes, it is all grassroots social movement work, which is to say unpaid, and Extinction Rebellion is purposefully decentralized. And I think that's for many reasons. They don't want to create a hierarchy where if something falls apart, the whole thing collapses. And also that decentralization is a great way of getting more action in the streets. Extinction Rebellion has principles, and any 3 people who are abiding by the principles, which is nonviolence, and there's a whole other, I think there's 10 principles, you can take action in the name of Extinction Rebellion as long as you are abiding by those principles. Now that's, I think, very smart because it allows more people to sort of find the piece of climate they're passionate about and take action, and to use nonviolent civil disobedience to affect change. It's also a little bit risky. Let's say someone violates that principle and does take action. It could threaten the movement, right? If someone, does use violence, right? The media will cover that, and that will be the end of Extinction Rebellion. And you can say that's not our principle, but there is a ton of organization and planning that goes through Extinction Rebellion while being a decentralized organization. As sort of an example of that, right now, we as an organization have committed to pursuing our demand for all of 2023, which is no new fossil fuel infrastructure in the state of Massachusetts. So we're sort of breaking down our demands into this sub-demand, which is the first step. There are new fossil fuel plants being installed in Massachusetts today that haven't broken ground yet. There are pipeline replacements, well, I say replacements in quotes because they're actually replacing it with a bigger pipeline. So that, to me, is new fossil fuel infrastructure, and there's new gas lines going into buildings every day. So we're not taking the first step, which is there's no new infrastructure starting today, right? And that's the demand we're focused on. But we're not disallowing anyone from doing an action about animal rights or private jet flying, right? Someone can still do something else that's not specifically fossil fuel infrastructure focused. So in that way, we're decentralized, but also have some organization to help us sort of be effective and lead us somewhere. So it's an interesting balance.
You talked about this, I think you even used the word shame, about, maybe being a little bit hesitant to display or assert your environmental ethic among friends sometimes. And that kind of resonated with me because I feel disappointed in myself about that, where there's just sometimes I just say, you know what, I'm just not going to choose this battle. I'm just going to watch and let this group of the family trash the environment today, and I'm not going to make an issue. But you've done something else as part of Extinction Rebellion that I think takes a lot of guts. I'd be curious about which you think takes more guts, to confront friends and family or a group of strangers, like to walk onto a subway and sermonize, which you've done.
Yes. That was an idea started in the New York City Extinction Rebellion chapter started that a couple years ago. And I saw a clip of it and said, I want to do that here because it's such an interesting social dynamic. People commuting, it's very quiet in the subway cars and everyone's on their phones. And I think when someone gets up and makes a speech, it's a very captive audience, but it's a very difficult audience because you have 2 minutes to make the spiel and to reach people's hearts. So it was such an interesting exercise, and it was intimidating because you have to feel like what you're bringing is important enough to disrupt their day-to-day, right? And not in the way that we're blocking their commute home or anything that like a protest would, but I need your attention, and I think that's because this is really important. And so someone's making the speech while others hand out the flyers to the people that we're speaking to in hopes that if that speech moved them, they would know where to plug into. So it's a new tactic of ours that we just started a couple months ago, and it was really thrilling.
Well, so cool. I definitely want to share some audio from the video of that.
Hi everyone, pardon the interruption. I'm not asking for your money, but I am asking you to look up. My name is James, I'm 32 years old, and I'm terrified of the climate crisis. I don't want the latter half of my life to be spent mourning what I was able to enjoy the first half of my life. I'm imploring you to avert this destruction with me. Carbon levels in the atmosphere are at an all-time high. This year alone, flooding in Pakistan covered 1/3 of the country, extreme heat scorched Europe, hurricanes ravaged the South, and 95% of Massachusetts was in severe drought conditions. This is at 1.2 degrees Celsius warming. Imagine what our carbon path of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius will look like. Crop failure, mass migrations, and resource wars lurk just around the corner. The impacts get exponentially worse and harder for us to mitigate. Our governments have shown nothing but incompetence and false promises in handling this crisis. Climate scientists tell us to halt emissions to net zero by 2030, yet state and federal goals get us to net zero by 2050, decades later than what is needed, and with no real plan to get us there. Mass movements have been one of the only ways that progress has been made in this country. The suffragettes, civil rights, gay rights. The government doesn't act unless we get in the streets and demand it. We must and we can demand real climate action. Nonviolent direct action works. I know you care deeply about this, whether it's for you, your future, your family, nature, the beauty around you, other species, fresh air, or clean water. The biggest threat to all of us is assuming that someone else is going to save us. It is you, and the time is now. Please fight for a livable future with us. Extinction Rebellion Boston. Information is on the website on the flyer. Thank you for listening.
So that was very cool. I mean, you obviously have to have some real confidence. I think that ought to be a chapter of Toastmasters.
So, James, what was the sentiment or the vibe, I guess, that you experienced from the audience, the strangers, and how did you feel telling those people what was important to you compared to, for example, telling your family and friends in a social media post what's important to you?
Yeah, great question. I mean, social media, you have the veil of social media, right? So I put it out there and I don't get to see your reaction to it. But this is in person, and these are people I don't know. That I have no idea if the person sitting next to me, what their politics or opinions are, and are they going to heckle me or are they going to clap for me? It was intimidating, and it's a performance. You're doing a speech, and so I had nerves going into it. But once you start the first word, you're in it now. You're saying, hey, excuse me, and everyone's looking at you like, oh, you better say something now, because if you back off, you're going to be an idiot.
Can't just say, never mind.
Yeah, actually, I changed my mind. So, it was interesting writing that because I'm trying to keep it to a certain number of words to put both facts in it and also emotional connection in it. Because if you just throw facts at people, they're going to turn away. But you're inviting them in, and so you have to add some emotional piece to it as well. Thankfully, we got mostly very positive reactions. We had 2 subway cars clap, and that's because I think one person clapped. We had one person who was like really into it and started clapping, and so others started clapping. And it catches on, and I think that changes the whole vibe. If people see support for this crazy person who just stood up on a train and gave this message, like, oh, maybe other people do think it's that serious too. And if you don't get that, if it's quiet, then I think everyone's going to stay quiet. So we had Mostly positive reactions, a lot of neutral, a lot of you don't know if you spoke to that person or not. They're probably embarrassed to speak to you as well. They're not going to say, hey, that was really cool, even if they think it. So you're kind of hoping as you leave the subway car that there are people who are thinking that. There's only 1 or 2 people who were anti. We do the 2-minute speech, you change to the next car, and you do it in the next car. And so you're doing these very quickly in succession. And we kind of look silly sprinting to the next car.
And you probably get pretty darn good at it by the time you finish.
You do. Yeah, it becomes it's a whole dance. I think it was only the second one that I did where someone in sort of near the beginning of my speech yelled out, "No one cares!" But it was a little more vulgar than that. And we had someone who was not part of our group yell back, "I do, let him finish." And that was really important because it silenced them. I mean, they stopped. They were embarrassed now. I was embarrassed when that person spoke up, and then that person was embarrassed. And so I thanked that person for what they said because it allowed me to continue. And I think there was one other person who was not a fan, but I think this person was sort of just triggered by the fact that someone was kind of shouting, because the subway cars in Boston are loud. Steph knows that. A lot of squeaks. So you have to speak very loudly. And I think she was kind of startled. And I don't think she knew who we were because the startle, she was saying comments about us attacking them. And we were like, no, we're a climate group. We're just trying to talk to you. So I don't think that person understood it and maybe had a bad day. But yeah, it went positively. And like any performance, you leave it with, your butterflies subside and, you get a high. At least I get a high from it. I'm an extrovert, so that's maybe not everyone would get a high from it, but I left it being like, okay, let's go to the next car.
But you've never been beat up.
No.
As part of the training for the team to sort of be prepared in case there's a violent reaction, or is there just never a violent reaction?
Not everybody is trained up on that, but we do have, especially for the, for the in the street protest work, we have de-escalators who are trained on de-escalation tactics, which is really important because if you do get someone who's really irate, we know how to deal with them. 2 kind of interesting tactics to take, one at the micro, one at the macro. The micro is to separate them. You just say, hey, can I talk to you for a second? You just want to get them away from whatever is making them feel excited. And so you're just going to sidebar with them. An interesting thing that we do in our protests is we sing. We also do chants, but chanting, if you were to start chanting, it sort of raises your own heart rate and gets you in an agitated state, even if what you're chanting is something peaceful, versus singing is a way of calming yourself down and lowering your heart rate. And that's going to have the same effect for anyone who is in front of you. If someone doesn't agree with what you're saying and you're yelling, that's going to agitate them. So they're going to be more likely to confront you. Versus if you're singing, maybe they call you a hippie and they keep walking, But it also is important in displaying nonviolence of, we're not going to break anything here. We're not going to hurt anybody. We are here because we care, and we're going to sing this message to you.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah, this is so interesting to learn about all the nuance and the intentionality behind it, the planning behind it. It's really, really cool to learn about.
Yeah.
But all of this climate stuff and extinction stuff really pales in comparison to the real ecological emergency we face, which is the great bubble wrap gyre.
That's really why I'm in this.
Yeah.
I really just hate bubble wrap.
That is the global emergency that I'm glad you're working on.
Yeah, and I think, Dad, you're referring to one of James's great social media posts, a video that you did. I think you did that 2 years ago, where you're basically trying to educate people about what's recyclable, what's not recyclable. Should we play that?
Yeah, this is really pretty entertaining. You almost have to see James wrapped in bubble wrap.
From head to toe, pretty much.
You can use your imagination. Yeah.
This is bubble wrap, and I found all of this bubble wrap in the recycling bin in my apartment complex. So I thought this would be a good time to remind everyone that you cannot recycle plastic film, things like bubble wrap and bread bags and rice bags, and obviously your traditional plastic bags. All of this plastic film cannot be recycled in your single stream services. That is for hard plastics only. Even if the bag has a little recyclable number on it, that just means it is made out of recyclable plastic, but not necessarily that it's recyclable in your bin. You need to bring plastic film to a specific place that recycles plastic film. Most grocery stores have a bin in the front somewhere where you can recycle plastic film. So I'm going to take all of this with me to the grocery store to recycle it in one of those containers. Thank you so much for listening, and remember that the point is to avoid all this plastic because it ends up as microplastics in our environment and then we consume them, and it's silly. So remember to bring your produce bags to the grocery store, your reusable bags. If you're ordering something that needs all this packaging in the first place, can you get it in person, not shipped to your house? Can you curb your Amazon addiction? We're all responsible for keeping this planet healthy and happy, even though it is on corporations and government to make it easier for consumers to make better choices. So we should keep pressuring in that way and not blaming ourselves for consuming for what's available. But where we have the power and the ability, let's make better choices for ourselves and for our planet.
Now I understand why you've got 1 million followers on TikTok.
Yeah, no, not quite the case.
All those people need to hear your message. But seriously, James, thank you for all that you do. You're so inspiring to me. I'm really love being your friend. And I'm really glad that you were able to join us for our podcast episode today.
It's an absolute pleasure to talk to both of you. Steph, being your friend is a joy. And Dave, I'm so glad that we have met in person before recording this. It was great to meet you as well. And thank you for all that you do in terms of your education and outreach with this podcast and telling the truth and doing it in a way that's accessible to people. I admire you both for that. So I'm very honored to be a guest on your show.
Well, I'm made of rubber, you're made of glue. Bounces off me and right back to you. Seriously, thank you. It's so great to see you doing that kind of work. Keep it up, and I hope that you feel the rewards in your heart and that you never stop. We need you.
Okay, so usually we try and include our Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint segment, and oftentimes we invite guests. I think, James, you're the perfect guest to invite to join us for the segment today where we...
No, he's going to embarrass us.
He's going to inspire us.
He's going to put us to shame.
But yeah, where each of us share how we've been reducing our footprints in some way. I'll just start. Mine is I recently purchased a shampoo bar that is in bar form instead of the liquid form in a plastic bottle. So it comes in a paper box and then it lasts a really long time. I've just now started using it. I'm really enjoying it so far. It seems to make my hair very nice and soft and clean. So I'm a fan, and it reduces plastic waste. So that's mine.
Very impressive. James, you want to go second?
I'll go second. We just talked about a lot of them, right? And I wanted to be real and do one that I've done recently, which is I've been stockpiling clothes with holes in them. My friends make fun of me because I am still wearing the same clothes I was wearing in college. And some of them are just worn up to bits. So there's actually 2 places around where I live where you can do sort of like a make and mend night. And so I'm going to bring the clothes with holes that I've sort of put into a bag in my closet to repair them. And that might mean just sewing up the hole and stitching it, or using one pair of pants to mend 2 other pairs of pants with patches. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to sew, so I'm going to go to this. There's a fabrics shop nearby and also a toiletries shop nearby that both do make and mend type events. So I'm going to go and hopefully learn the skills to do it on my own.
That's awesome. I thought you were going to say that you were planning to layer 2 shirts on top of each other so that like if there was a hole in one, the other shirt underneath would still cover you.
I didn't think of that.
Steve Bannon is doing that. That's why he wears 4 shirts at a time.
But no, that's great. That's a great one.
Yeah. So mine, I hadn't come up with anything, and I was getting ready for this conversation today, and I have to confess that I have to have some notes printed out and in front of me because I'm just not comfortable switching screens while I'm working my magic electronically here. But I try to minimize paper, and in fact, one of my obsessions is to waste as little paper as possible. And I can remember how, 20 years ago when I was running my filmmaking business with corporate clients all over the country, I would probably buy maybe a couple of cases of paper a year to run through the printer. And now I don't even go through a ream of new paper a year because of my obsessive compulsive tendencies. So here I have this 2-page agenda that Stephanie prepared to kind of guide us through the conversation, to remind us of what we wanted to talk about. And I'm going to print that out. And I'm thinking, it's just a little over 1 page. I'll bet you I could reformat this a little bit and get it to just print on 1 page, because then I would print it on used paper and it would only take 1 sheet of paper. So I spent quite a bit of time
reformatting the damn thing. I mean, I got it down. I will waste 15 minutes if I have to, reformatting the bullet points and everything, trying to get it so that it fits on one page. So that's a part of my obsession is, to not be killing any more trees than necessary, running paper through the printer or wasting ink either. But we almost never print anything on virgin paper anyway. We're always printing on the backside of some piece of paper that was already used for something else. Anything we get, junk mail we get, we have a bin where we put used paper, and we're actually going through all of these old records from 10, 15, 20 years ago. I don't know if I'll ever run out of paper. And we have a little place for note paper in the kitchen, and we never buy new note paper. That bin is full of, whatever the medical insurance company mailed us last week, folded in half so that there's blank sides on both sides, and you can write a grocery list or a note to yourself on that. So that's my OC paper reduction footprint shrink.
Honestly, this is sounding very post-apocalyptic to me. Like, there's no more paper on the planet. And so you're scrounging for any paper that you can use.
Well, we should behave like that. And, and it gives me joy to know that I am saving the money and that we have better uses for trees. That's for darn sure. So there you go.
Good job, everyone. I'm printing on paper from 15 years ago. Such a dad thing. I love it.
Oh, crap. All right. Well, thanks for putting up with that, James. It's really been a pleasure.
Yes, absolutely. Likewise.
Well, that was a great conversation with James, and now I'm excited for the next part of our episode today, some listener feedback that we received. So, Dad, what interesting items appeared in our inbox since the last episode?
Well, we did get an email from John in response to episode 74, which was Bleak Friday, 8 billion postmortem and damage done by guilt. John wrote, I just want to say that the idea that we need more people to get more 1 in a billion geniuses is the most ridiculous and annoying argument ever. Inventions are dependent on prior invention and discovery, not the number of humans. We didn't invent cell phones before electricity or cars before horse carts because of a lack of humans. Proof of this is the number of inventions and discoveries that were made independently through history. There are famous examples like in 1876, Elijah Gray and Alexander Graham Bell independently on the same day filed patents for invention of the telephone. Another example, theory of evolution by natural selection, Charles Darwin, discovery about 1840, and Alfred Russel Wallace, discovery about 1857 to 1858, joint publication 1859. And a long list on Wikipedia, including some good quotes at the end. And he gives us a link, which we'll put in the show notes.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think I made it pretty obvious in that episode that I thought that was pretty stupid to think that we need billions of people in order to have intelligent contributions to society, civilization, culture, whatever you want to say.
Yeah, and you could argue that more humans are making more problems that now need to be solved that wouldn't have needed to be solved in the first place.
Yeah, in fact, we would probably have a whole lot more time on our hands to be more innovative and inventive and artistic. We could express our genius a lot more readily if we weren't so busy just trying to survive the apocalypse here,
So true.
We also got an email comment just from our year-end episode. The title of that episode was, A Vasectomy Could Save Herschel Walker a Lot of Money. Interestingly, I haven't gotten any comments about that title.
Very clever.
I thought it was.
Very eye-catching.
Everybody must have already had that thought. Anyway, Max wrote, in states that ban abortions, pro-abortion legislators should introduce bills to force DNA testing and financial support from dads. And if a man fathers more than one child where the woman didn't want to be a mother, he should have a choice between jail and vasectomy. Why load the whole burden of protecting unborn life on women? So how about that?
Quite an idea. Good luck getting those legislators in states that have banned abortions to get on board with an idea like that.
But not too surprising that we got pretty supportive feedback on the whole thing that I was celebrating, that men apparently are taking more responsibility these days.
Yep, absolutely. It shouldn't just be on women.
I've always said that, and it shouldn't have taken the demise of Roe v. Wade for that to happen. I have one late-breaking email I also want to share, Stephanie. I just got this yesterday from Tom in Texas. Happy New Year, Dr. Dave. I hope all is well with you and that you have a happy, growth-free year. I want to tattle to you about CNN. It was a fairly minor infraction, but it's emblematic of the mindset of most people. I would have expected better from CNN. Here's what I heard yesterday during a year's recap story that they did entitled All the Best, All the Worst 2022. At the end of a story stating that the U.S. population had ticked up to 333 million during the year, they said, "That's good. That's good for our economy." How can these reporters be held accountable to deliver the other side of such factoids?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, and you never hear anything like that from me. I never complain about the pro-growth bias that's just
rampant in our media. Yeah.
Rampant, you better believe it. And I wouldn't have expected better from CNN. Tom, I don't know why you're giving them more credit. Those journalists grew up drinking the same Kool-Aid everybody else reporting the news drank, and it's a huge challenge, and I've worked hard at that and have hardly made a dent in it. Stephanie, you might find this interesting. I wrote back to Tom and said, I've been thinking that maybe what it would take, or maybe it would help to hold some kind of a conference just for journalists where we educate them and enlighten them. We give them the information that they've been deprived of. I was thinking, now that everybody's used to virtual conferences, we could probably keep the costs down. You think that we might be able to attract some journalists? They might be curious enough to want to know what the heck these people are talking about who think that we need to go back to preschool when it comes to growth.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
I'll tell you what, I'll promise our listeners that we'll do it. All we need is some megabucks in order to do that. I've got to be able to hire somebody to help put that together, to coordinate that. So if you guys step it up, go to growthbusters.org/donate and just put a note in there that I want to designate this to support a conference to deprogram journalists. If we get enough interest, then let's just do it.
That's a great call to action.
So that's all I got.
Well, we love hearing from our listeners. We will share the most interesting feedback on our next episode. If you want to provide feedback, you can email us at podcast@growthbusters.org. You can also write a comment at this episode's page on the GrowthBusters website, or leave us a voice message at 719-402-1400, and we might be able to play that on our next episode.
That's right. We've got a hotline, and it's been pretty cold lately, so heat it up. Let your fingers do the walking. Having intelligent conversations about overshoot is so important, so please share this episode with the people you love or anyone who needs to learn about limits to growth. That could be your mayor, governor, senator, prime minister, president, journalist, you name it.
And be sure to follow the podcast on your podcast app so you don't miss an episode.
Check out the GrowthBusters online community at groups.io.
Thanks to Jake Fader for writing and producing the GrowthBusters theme you hear at the open and close of this podcast, and to Carlos Jones for singing it.
Learn more about the issues we discuss in this podcast at growthbusters.org.
That homepage is also where you can donate or get on our email list.
All right. If civilization doesn't collapse first, we'll see you next time.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.